homesteading historian fans. So I'm finally going to film my video of my senior seminar presentation I did for my senior seminar when I graduated from college back in 2013. So it's been about 10 years since I've done this, but lately I've been restudying it to do this presentation. So the main thesis of my paper was that the war impacted fashion for women through fabric, styles, and patriotic symbols. I focused more on Southern women than Northern women because Southern women like to write a lot more. So some of my major sources were Southern Women's Diaries, some newspaper, and fashion plates. In the first part of the paper, I talked about fabric. The second part, I talked about style. And the third part, I talked about patriotic symbols. And I'm actually doing this video, I forgot to mention, in 2 parts. So I'm just going to introduce my research and how I did my research and things like that. And secondary sources, which in history world, secondary sources are sources that were created after the event. So like books, nonfiction books, and things like that. So some of my secondary sources I used were, one of the big ones I used was this book, Who Wore What? Some of you may be familiar with this book. She talked a lot about how fabric was preserved by piecing items together. Cuffs were used to protect the dress. Undersleeves were used to protect the dress. It was also really, the best part about this book was that it was an excellent source for primary documentation. Primary source documentation. She has this huge list of books that are diaries and letters of women, both North and South, but a lot more Southern women than Northern women. That was really helpful in getting primary source documentation for this paper. So a lot of my primary source documentation came from that book. There was another book, Dressed by Photographer, Ordinary Americans in Fashion, 1840 to 1900 by Julian Sevra. She talked a lot about how women revived out-of-date home crafts like spinning and weaving during the Civil War because obviously due to the blockades that the North imposed on the South didn't have access to fabric resources like the North did. Some of the other primary sources I used were this Civil War Sisterhood, U.S. Sanitary Commission, Women's Politics and Transition by Judith Giesberg. This is a great book, by the way. I love this book. And it talked about how transport women kind of created their own nurse uniform by creating an avenues, which I will talk about at some point on this page channel. That's one way the war impacted styles and fashion. Another book that I used a lot for this paper was Republic of Suffering, Death in American Civil War by Drew Gilpin Faust. She talks a lot about how mourning fabric and mourning cloth became a really popular style during the Civil War. Some of the primary documents I used, again, primary source materials, like stuff that was produced during the events. So like diaries, like Mary Chestnut's diary, I used this one a lot. I used the Sarah Morgan, the Civil War diary of a Southern woman. This is a great book too, a really interesting book. Those were 2 books I used. Some other books that I used I don't have, but I used a lot were Blockaded Family by Parthenia Hogg. And then another book that I used a lot was The Diary of a Southern Refugee by Judith McGuire. So that's kind of the research I did, was a lot of secondary source material. And in the second part of this video, I'm going to talk a lot more about this my primary source material. But in this first part, I just wanted to talk about kind of the research. So that was kind of the research that I did. I'm trying to think. This is the amount of notes I got from my research from primary and secondary. So this is the amount of quotes I used in my paper. My paper ended up being about 30 pages long. So yeah, I have a lot of quotes to read in the coming video, part 2. So, but that's kind of my research. Those are the kind of sources I used. So if you have any questions, comment down below. And if you haven't, be sure to follow, like, comment, do all that jazz, and stay tuned for part 2.